October 27, 1962. Deep beneath the Caribbean Sea, an American soldier didn't refuse an order that could have started World War III. A Soviet officer did. Inside submarine B-59, the temperature had climbed past 120 degrees. The air was poison. For 4 days, American destroyers had been dropping explosions around them. Relentless, deafening, terrifying. The crew believed war had already begun. Captain Savitsky gave the order: prepare the nuclear torpedo. 1 weapon, 15 kilotons, enough to vaporize the American fleet above them and ignite the war that would end civilization. The political officer agreed. The weapon was armed. The protocol required 3 men to authorize launch. 2 had said yes. Only 1 man stood between that order and World War III. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. And in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by exhausted men ready to fire, he said the word that saved the world: no. But why? What gave him the strength to refuse when everyone around him demanded blood? The answer lies in a secret mission 1 year earlier, a nightmare aboard submarine K-19 that left him scarred, dying men in his arms, and a memory he could never escape, because the man who stopped World War III had already survived something worse than war. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this, the hidden moments that changed everything, are what you're here for, hit subscribe. Every day we uncover the Cold War secrets they never taught you in school. The decisions made in darkness, the courage no one saw, the truth buried for decades. Now, let's go back to October 1962 and discover how the world survived the day it should have ended. To understand why Vasily Arkhipov said no on October 27, 1962, we need to go back 13 days, to the moment the world discovered it was living on borrowed time. October 16, 1962, the White House, early morning. President John F. Kennedy is shown a series of photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane flying over western Cuba. The images are grainy, black and white, taken from 70,000 feet. But to the intelligence analysts standing in the Oval Office, they're unmistakable. Soviet nuclear missile sites, under construction, capable of striking American cities within minutes. Kennedy stares at the photographs in silence. Washington, New York, Atlanta, Miami, all within range. The missiles aren't operational yet, but they will be soon. Days, maybe weeks. The clock has started and no one knows how much time is left. The crisis that will define the Cold War has begun. Kennedy's options are limited and all of them are terrible. A military strike could destroy the missile sites, but it would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel and trigger retaliation. A full invasion of Cuba could work, but it would take weeks to organize and might provoke a Soviet response in Europe. Diplomacy seems pointless. Khrushchev has been lying about the missiles for months, denying their existence even as they were being installed. On October 22nd, Kennedy makes his decision. He addresses the nation on live television, his voice calm but firm. He announces a naval blockade around Cuba, though he carefully avoids that word, calling it a quarantine instead, a semantic trick to avoid the legal definition of an act of war. Any ship attempting to reach Cuba will be stopped, boarded, and searched. Any ship carrying offensive weapons will be turned back. The message to Moscow is clear. The missiles must go, or there will be war. Khrushchev's response is defiant. He calls the blockade an act of piracy, a violation of international law. Soviet ships will not turn back, he declares. They will continue to Cuba, and any attempt to stop them will be met with force. The world holds its breath. Newspapers run headlines about nuclear war. Families stock their basements with canned food and water. Schools conduct air raid drills, teaching children to hide under their desks as if wood and metal could protect them from a nuclear blast. In New York, people stand on street corners staring at the sky, wondering if today will be the day the sirens sound. But the real danger isn't happening in Washington or Moscow. It's happening in the Atlantic Ocean, beneath the surface, where no one can see it. 4 Soviet submarines have already left their base in the Arctic, weeks before the crisis began. Their mission is simple: escort Soviet cargo ships to Cuba and defend them if necessary. They're Foxtrot-class submarines, diesel-powered, designed for cold northern waters. Each one carries 22 torpedoes. And on each submarine, one of those torpedoes is tipped with a nuclear warhead, a weapon with the explosive power of 15 kilotons, roughly the size of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The submarines have been ordered to maintain strict radio silence. They're to avoid detection at all costs and proceed to their stations off the Cuban coast. The crews haven't been told about the political crisis unfolding above them. They don't know about Kennedy's speech or Khrushchev's defiance. They don't know that the world is on the edge of war. All they know is their orders: stay hidden, stay quiet, and wait. Submarine B-59 is one of these 4 vessels. Its commander is Captain Valentin Savitsky, a career naval officer with a reputation for discipline and pride. But the real authority aboard B-59 belongs to a quieter man, the second captain, Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov is 36 years old, tall, lean, with sharp features and calm eyes. He joined the Soviet Navy at 19 and has spent nearly 2 decades at sea. He's methodical, careful, the kind of officer who thinks 3 steps ahead. His crew respects him not because he's loud or charismatic, but because he's fair, competent, and unshakable under pressure. But Arkhipov carries something with him that most officers don't. A memory that haunts him every day. 1 year earlier, in July 1961, he served as executive officer aboard the submarine K-19 during its first patrol. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a demonstration of Soviet naval power in the North Atlantic. But 8 days into the voyage, disaster struck. The submarine's nuclear reactor began to leak. Coolant flooded into the reactor compartment. The temperature inside spiked to dangerous levels. If the reactor wasn't contained, it would explode, destroying the submarine and releasing a radioactive cloud into the ocean. The captain made the decision. He called for volunteers to enter the reactor room and make emergency repairs. 8 men stepped forward. Arkhipov was one of them. They knew it was a death sentence. The radiation levels inside the compartment were lethal. But if they didn't act, everyone aboard would die, and the explosion might be mistaken for an American attack, triggering the war both superpowers feared. They worked in relays, each man spending only a few minutes inside the reactor before staggering out, vomiting, skin burning. Arkhipov went in twice. He welded pipes with his bare hands while radiation tore through his cells. The makeshift repairs held. The reactor was contained. The submarine limped back to port. All 8 men who entered the reactor room died within weeks. Arkhipov survived, though his body carried the scars. Radiation burns on his hands and arms, damage to his bone marrow that would never fully heal. He had looked into the face of nuclear fire. He had held dying men. He knew, in a way most people never would, what these weapons really did. And now, as B-59 slipped beneath the surface and headed south toward Cuba, Arkhipov carried that knowledge with him like a wound that wouldn't close. The journey south becomes a descent into hell. The Foxtrot-class submarines were built for the cold, dark waters of the Arctic, designed to operate beneath ice floes where the temperature rarely climbs above freezing. Their diesel engines generate enormous heat, but in northern waters, that's manageable. The ocean itself acts as a cooling system, drawing warmth away from the hull. But the Caribbean is different. The water temperature hovers near 80 degrees. There's no relief, no natural cooling. As B-59 pushes deeper into tropical waters, the heat inside the submarine becomes unbearable. Within days, the temperature climbs past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, then 100, then 110. The ventilation systems, never designed for this climate, struggle to circulate air. Carbon dioxide levels rise. The air becomes thick, soupy, difficult to breathe. Men strip down to their underwear, their skin slick with sweat that has nowhere to evaporate. They lie on the metal deck plates gasping, trying to find cooler air that doesn't exist. Sleep becomes impossible. The heat penetrates everything, the bunks, the walls, the very air they breathe. Sailors take turns standing near the few ventilation shafts, gulping down slightly fresher air before staggering back to their posts. Some collapse from heat exhaustion. Others develop infections from the constant moisture. The ship's doctor moves through the cramped corridors, checking pulses, administering salt tablets, rationing water that tastes like diesel and rust. Arkhipov watches his crew suffer. He sees young sailors, boys really, 18 and 19 years old, crying quietly in the darkness, their bodies pushed beyond endurance. He sees men hallucinating, muttering to themselves, staring at bulkheads as if they can see through the steel to the world above. And then the Americans find them. The U.S. Navy has known about the Soviet submarines almost from the moment they left port. American intelligence tracked their departure, calculated their route, and positioned assets along their projected path. Now, as the submarines approach the Caribbean, U.S. destroyers converge on their positions with mechanical precision. The Americans have orders. Locate the submarines, force them to surface, but do not fire unless fired upon. The blockade is supposed to be bloodless, a show of force designed to compel Soviet compliance without starting a shooting war. But the submarines complicate everything. They're a wild card hidden beneath the surface, potentially armed with weapons the Americans don't know about. To force them up, the destroyers employ a tactic called practice depth charging. They drop small explosive grenades into the water, harmless devices designed to create noise and concussive force without actually damaging the submarine. The idea is simple. Make enough noise, create enough pressure, and the submarine commander will realize he's been detected and surface voluntarily. But inside B-59, there's no way to know these are practice charges. The first explosion hits like a sledgehammer against the hull. The sound is beyond deafening, a physical force that rattles teeth, stops hearts, turns the entire submarine into a resonating drum of terror. Men scream. Some drop to the deck, covering their ears, certain the hull is breaching. Then another explosion, and another, and another. The pattern continues for hours. Every few minutes, another blast. The crew tries to track them, to predict when the next one will hit, but there's no rhythm, no logic. Sometimes 5 minutes pass, sometimes 30 seconds. The randomness is its own kind of torture. Captain Savitsky orders evasive maneuvers. B-59 dives deeper, changes course, cuts engines to reduce noise, but the Americans follow. Their sonar is too good, their ships too numerous. Wherever B-59 goes, the destroyers are waiting. The depth charges continue. Days blur together. The crew loses track of time. Is it day or night above the surface? Has it been 3 days or 4? The heat, the explosions, the poisoned air, everything merges into a single, endless nightmare. Arkhipov moves through the submarine, checking on his men, offering quiet words of encouragement. But even he can feel the psychological toll. The isolation is complete. They're alone in the dark, being hunted, with no information and no contact with the outside world. And then, on October 27th, the radio fails. B-59's communication equipment, corroded by heat and moisture, stops functioning. They can no longer receive orders from Moscow. They can't hear Soviet broadcasts. They have no way of knowing what's happening in the world above, whether the blockade is holding, whether diplomacy is working, whether war has already begun. For Captain Savitsky and his crew, the silence is worse than the explosions. Because now they're operating blind, cut off from command, forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and mounting fear. And in that darkness, with his crew suffering and his ship under relentless attack, Savitsky begins to believe the worst. That the depth charges aren't a warning. They're the opening shots of World War III. By the afternoon of October the 27th, submarine B-59 has been underwater for nearly 4 full days. The conditions inside have crossed the threshold from unbearable to catastrophic. The temperature now exceeds 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men are no longer sweating. Their bodies have nothing left to give. Dehydration has set in across the crew. Lips crack and bleed. Skin takes on a grayish pallor. Some sailors have stopped speaking entirely, conserving what little energy remains. The air itself has become toxic. Carbon dioxide levels have climbed so high that simply breathing requires conscious effort. Every inhalation feels thick, inadequate. Men's heads throb with constant pain. Vision blurs at the edges. Rational thought becomes difficult, then nearly impossible. Above them, the American destroyers have tightened their formation. 11 warships now surround B-59's position, along with the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. The practice depth charges have intensified. One every few minutes now, a steady drumbeat of concussive force that never stops, never relents. Inside the command compartment, Captain Valentin Savitsky stands gripping a railing, his knuckles white. He's 44 years old, a decorated officer who has spent his entire adult life in service to the Soviet Navy. He joined during the Great Patriotic War, survived the brutal naval campaigns in the Baltic, earned his command through competence and unwavering loyalty to the motherland. But now, watching his crew collapse around him, listening to the endless explosions, cut off from all communication with Moscow, something inside him breaks. He turns to his officers, his voice hoarse from the heat and poisoned air. "They're trying to destroy us," he says. "They wouldn't do this unless war has already started. Moscow must have been attacked. Our ships must be sinking above us." The political officer, Ivan Simonovich Maslenikov, nods in agreement. In the Soviet system, political officers hold enormous power. They're the party's representatives aboard ship, responsible for ideological purity and political loyalty. Maslenikov is a true believer, a man who sees the world in stark terms: Soviet versus American, communism versus capitalism, survival versus annihilation. "We cannot let them destroy us without fighting back," Maslenikov says. "We must defend ourselves. We must defend the motherland." Savitsky's eyes move to the weapons station. Every officer aboard knows what they're carrying. The nuclear torpedo, a T-5, sits in its tube, armed and ready. 15 kilotons of explosive power, enough to vaporize the American ships above them, enough to turn the Caribbean into a radioactive grave. The protocol is clear. To launch a nuclear weapon from a Soviet submarine requires the unanimous agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the second captain. It's a safeguard, a check against rash decisions designed to ensure that no single man can start a nuclear war alone. Savitsky has made his decision. His voice rises, cutting through the oppressive heat and the distant thunder of depth charges. "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the laughingstock of the fleet. We will not disgrace our navy." The crew freezes. Some of the younger sailors look terrified. Others nod, their faces hard with exhausted rage. After 4 days of hell, after being hunted and bombed and suffocated, the idea of striking back carries a terrible appeal. Maslenikov doesn't hesitate. "I agree," he says. "We must launch." The torpedo crew begins preparations. Hands move across controls. The targeting solution is calculated. The weapon is brought to final readiness. The process takes only minutes. Soviet submarines are designed for speed, for the ability to strike before the enemy knows what's happening. 2 officers have given their authorization. According to Soviet protocol, only 1 more is needed. Every man in the command compartment turns to look at Vasily Arkhipov. He stands near the navigation station, his uniform dark with sweat, his face drawn with exhaustion. He's been awake for most of the last 4 days, moving through the submarine, checking on his men, trying to maintain order and discipline as everything falls apart around them. Now, in this moment, the weight of the world rests on his shoulders in a way no one else can see. Arkhipov looks at Savitsky. He sees the desperation in the captain's eyes, the rage, the humiliation of being hunted like an animal. He understands it. Part of him even shares it. But he also sees something Savitsky has lost in the heat and chaos and isolation: clarity. They don't know what's happening above the surface. They haven't received orders to attack. They haven't confirmed that war has begun. All they have are explosions and silence, and 4 days of suffering that has stripped away rational judgment, leaving only fear and pride and the terrible human desire to strike back at those who've caused pain. Arkhipov takes a slow breath of the poisoned air, and then, in a voice that's quiet but absolutely steady, he speaks the word that will save 800 million lives. No. The command compartment erupts. Savitsky turns on Arkhipov, his face contorted with fury. "What did you say?" "I said no," Arkhipov repeats. His voice is still calm, but there's steel beneath it. "We cannot launch without confirmation. We don't know what's happening up there." "We know they're attacking us!" Savitsky shouts, gesturing upward as another depth charge explodes somewhere in the distance. "We know they've been bombing us for 4 days. We know we've lost communication with Moscow. What more confirmation do you need?" "An order," Arkhipov says simply. "We need an order from command. We need confirmation that war has been declared. We don't have that." Maslenikov steps forward, his political authority lending weight to his words. "Comrade Arkhipov, we are under attack. The Americans are trying to destroy us. To hesitate now is to betray the motherland. Is that what you want? To be remembered as the coward who let the Americans sink a Soviet submarine without firing a shot?" The accusation hangs in the stifling air. Around them, crew members watch in silence. Some are nodding, agreeing with Savitsky and Maslenikov. Others look uncertain, torn between duty and the growing suspicion that something is terribly wrong with this decision. Arkhipov doesn't flinch. "If they wanted to destroy us, they would have done it already," he says. "These explosions, they're not torpedoes. They're not depth charges designed to kill. They're something else. A signal, maybe. A warning, but not an attack." "You don't know that," Savitsky snaps. "And you don't know that war has started," Arkhipov counters. "We're cut off. We're exhausted. We're making decisions based on fear, not facts." The argument escalates, voices rise. Other officers join in, some supporting Savitsky, others quietly siding with Arkhipov. The command compartment, never spacious to begin with, feels like it's shrinking, the walls pressing in as the debate rages. Savitsky plays his final card. "I am the captain of this vessel. The decision is mine. The protocol requires 3 authorizations," Arkhipov says quietly. "You have 2. You need mine. And I'm telling you, we cannot do this. Not without confirmation, not without orders. Then you condemn us all to death." "Maybe," Arkhipov says, "but I won't condemn the world." The words land like a physical blow. The compartment falls silent except for the hum of failing equipment and the ragged breathing of exhausted men. Arkhipov steps closer to Savitsky, lowering his voice so only the captain and a few nearby officers can hear. "Valentin," he says, using the captain's first name. A breach of protocol, but a gesture of respect, of shared humanity. "I know what you're feeling. I know what these weapons do. I was aboard K-19. I went into that reactor. I held men while they died from radiation poisoning. I know what nuclear fire does to human beings." Savitsky's expression flickers. Everyone in the Soviet Navy knows about K-19, the disaster, the sacrifice, the men who went into the reactor knowing they wouldn't come out alive. "If we launch that torpedo," Arkhipov continues, "we won't just sink the American ships above us. We'll start the war that ends everything. Moscow will retaliate, Washington will retaliate, and within hours the missiles will fly, not just here, everywhere, every city, every base, every target they've planned for years. He pauses, letting the words sink in. We survived K-19 because we made the right choice in the worst moment. 8 men died to save the submarine, to save the mission, to prevent something worse. This is the same. We're being tested, and the right choice is to wait, to surface, to find out what's really happening before we destroy the world. The silence stretches. Savitsky stares at Arkhipov, his jaw working, his hands trembling. Whether from rage or exhaustion or the terrible weight of the decision, no one can tell. Finally, after what feels like hours but is probably only minutes, Savitsky exhales. The fight drains out of him. He looks suddenly older, more fragile, a man who has reached the absolute limit of his endurance. "Stand down," he says quietly to the weapons crew. "Cancel the launch order." Then, his voice barely audible, he adds, "Prepare to surface." The relief that floods through the command compartment is almost physical. Some men slump against the bulkheads, others close their eyes, offering silent prayers. A few begin to weep, not from fear anymore, but from the sudden release of tension that has held them rigid for days. Arkhipov says nothing. He simply nods once to Savitsky, then turns to help coordinate the surfacing procedure. He has just saved the world, and no one outside this submarine will know for 40 years. When submarine B-59 breaks the surface on the evening of October 27, 1962, the scene is surreal. The Caribbean sun hangs low on the horizon, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Around the submarine, 11 American destroyers form a tight circle, their gun turrets trained on the vessel but not firing. Helicopters circle overhead, their rotors chopping the air. On the decks of the nearest destroyers, American sailors stand at attention, watching in silence as the Soviet submarine's hatch opens. The first men to emerge stumble onto the deck like survivors of a shipwreck. They're skeletal, hollow-eyed, their skin pale beneath layers of grime and sweat. Some collapse immediately onto the steel plating, unable to stand. Others lean against the conning tower, gulping down fresh air as if they've been drowning. One young sailor drops to his knees and vomits seawater and bile. Another lies flat on his back, arms spread wide, staring up at the sky with an expression of disbelief, as if he can't quite accept that the nightmare is over, that there's still a world above the darkness. The American sailors watch in stunned silence. Whatever they expected, defiance, aggression, military discipline, this isn't it. These aren't soldiers ready to fight. They're broken men, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. No shots are fired, no orders are shouted. For a long moment, there's only the sound of waves lapping against hulls and the distant cry of seabirds. Captain Savitsky emerges last, his uniform soaked through, his face drawn. He exchanges brief words with the American commander via radio, his voice flat, mechanical. B-59 is escorted out of the quarantine zone under American supervision, a humiliation that will haunt Savitsky for the rest of his career. The submarine begins the long journey back towards Soviet waters. Aboard the vessel, the crew gradually recovers, physically at least. The psychological scars will take longer to heal. Savitsky retreats to his quarters and writes his official report. It's a clinical document, focused on equipment failures and environmental challenges. He mentions nothing about the nuclear torpedo, nothing about the argument with Arkhipov, nothing about how close they came to launching. In the rigid hierarchy of the Soviet Navy, to acknowledge the incident would be to admit weakness, to confess that they nearly lost control. The report is filed, classified, and forgotten. Arkhipov returns to his duties in silence. There's no commendation, no recognition, no acknowledgement of what he prevented. In fact, his career suffers quietly in the aftermath. Some in the Soviet command see his refusal not as wisdom, but as insubordination, a failure to support his captain in a moment of crisis. He's passed over for certain promotions, assigned to less prestigious positions. He never speaks publicly about what happened aboard B-59. When asked about the Cuban crisis years later, he offers only vague generalities about the difficulty of submarine operations. The story remains locked inside him, another secret among thousands in the Cold War's vast archive of hidden truths. The Cuban Missile Crisis ends the next day, October 28th. Khrushchev announces that Soviet missiles will be removed from Cuba. Kennedy, in a secret agreement, promises to remove American missiles from Turkey within months. The world celebrates, relief flooding through cities and towns across the globe. Headlines declare victory for diplomacy, for reason, for the triumph of cooler heads over nuclear brinkmanship. But no one knows about B-59. No one knows about the torpedo that was armed and ready. No one knows about the captain who gave the order and the second captain who refused it. Vasily Arkhipov continues his naval career. He rises to the rank of vice admiral. He commands submarines, trains officers, serves his country with the same quiet competence that defined his entire life. But the radiation exposure from K-19 never leaves him. It weakens his immune system, damages his bone marrow, creates complications that worsen with age. He retires from the Navy in the 1980s and lives quietly with his wife, Olga, in a modest apartment outside Moscow. They have 2 daughters. He gardens. He reads. He watches the Soviet Union collapse and a new Russia emerge from its ruins. In August 1998, at the age of 72, Vasily Arkhipov dies from complications related to the radiation poisoning he suffered aboard K-19 37 years earlier. His obituary in the Russian Naval Journal is brief. It mentions his rank, his service record, his decorations. It says nothing about October 27, 1962. Nothing about the decision he made in the darkness beneath the Caribbean Sea. Nothing about the 800 million lives he saved. The secret dies with him, or so everyone believes.